Hello and welcome to CTRL+F, the NSI Cyber and Tech Center's podcast, coming to you live from the Reagan National Defense Forum. My name is Jessica Jones, and I'm joined by the NSI Cyber and Tech Center founder and ED, Jamil Jaffer. We've got a very special guest today, Andy Lowery. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, as you guys know, this series is recorded live. We're bringing together the top leaders from the policy world, industry, and venture capital to talk about pressing challenges for U.S. national security. Andy is CEO of Epirus, which is a team who are pioneering cutting-edge directed energy systems. Prior to Epirus, Andy held various roles at high-tech startups, including co-founder and CEO of RealWear, the world leader of industrial head-up display wearable systems, and co-founder of Dacry, where he pioneered mixed reality wearables for enterprise applications.
And I have my Apple Vision Pro sitting right over there just for the record.
Just right off the camera, right off the camera.
You know, the funny thing is the hardware group at Apple was started by a small group, and it was called, believe it or not, I think Meta or something like that, but it was a different Meta, and it wasn't the big Meta now. And they were actual interns at Dacry.
No way.
And so a lot of the Vision Pro has legacy way back to Dacry. It really, really does, because some of the stuff like eye tracking and all that, we were really pioneers.
You're like, I need to get some Apple stock. You're like, where is it?
We'll see.
I wore that Vision Pro on the flight here the entire time. People were like, who's this weirdo? But it was awesome. I was working on my laptop the entire way through.
Yeah. Good. Well, it's
your tech.
It's
your tech.
It's getting there.
We'll also talk a little more. Also retired Lieutenant Commander from the U.S. Navy, bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Okay, lots to get through.
Right.
Andy, let's first start with your work at Epirus. Where you're leading efforts to pioneer cutting-edge directed energy systems. First, for those of us, what exactly is directed energy and how high-power microwave systems? Walk us through what that means, how does that work, and what that means, how they relate to national security.
Okay, sure. I'm gonna answer you as short as you possibly can ever probably imagine. I'm gonna do two words.
Okay.
Force fields. Seriously, force fields.
Like Star Trek force fields?
Like Star Trek force fields. Star Wars force field. Get the shield generators. Somebody hit the shield generators. We're making shield generators. It's the first shield generator that the human race has created.
Not in a movie.
Not in the movies. This is real life. And so let me explain. Let me explain. So what we've done is we've used a electronically steered, what they call a phased array. They can electronically steer a beam. Like if anybody's been to a laser show before, they could have one laser, could steer an entire picture and looks like it's producing an entire picture. So you can do that with microwaves too. You can steer the beam as fast as the speed of light nearly, and you can create huge walls or volumes or sections of the sky where you put high powered electromagnetic energy. So high of a power that electronics just cannot function under its influence. It's just not jamming it, not going in through a jamming circuit or anything like that. Just literally the electromagnetic pulse nature of the environment around it causes the drone engines to just stop. It seizes them up. They get confused. They don't know what's going on. And then they drop. And when they drop, they fall to the ground. They get destroyed. Somebody scoops them up and takes them in and says, who's with these bad guys, drones coming in after us? So in that way, we've created a force field generator. And we did it in a way like a box of Legos, where you can make a great big one if you want to make a big one to defend a base and you need a lot of range. If you need less range, like you want to defend a tank or the back end of a tank against drones that might be coming in to try to do a contact charge, you could put a short one, a small box, like no bigger than a case of wine, that can give you maybe 10 or 15 meters of a force field on the rear end of a tank. So there's all these various applications for force fields. I mean, when someone want to ask me, are you creating a platform? Well, it's a force field. So of course everyone will need a platform, will need a force field, right? Yeah. I mean, C-17s, vehicles, JLTVs, strikers, tanks, and bases, and then think beyond bases, borders, stadiums. This is a problem that we are seeing develop at an unprecedented rate, And we're only seeing the very tip of the iceberg. I think domestically especially, we are just naive on how bad and how much and how many of these drone incursions, and most of them today are just doing some kind of surveillance, which we don't even really know, but it could lead to something even more devastating. So we're hopeful to get our force fields out there prior to any of that happening, but we're working hand in hand with the Army because these type of systems usually take 10 or 15 years to get fielded, and we don't have that kind of time. So we have to go quick.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So the technology sounds amazing, but to your point, right? These things take forever to do. Scaling them is hard, right? How do you all think about one, the deployment problem, two, the scaling problem, and three, I mean, even as we see a new administration come in and talk about defense modernization, a lot of venture capital, PE folks coming to the administration. We see Stephen Feinberg as the Deputy Secretary of Defense designate, the Secretary of Army, Secretary of Navy, all with backgrounds in this space. Can we really bring this kind of stuff to deployment fast and particularly up to scale, to the scale and scope we need?
I believe we absolutely can. And I think it's the core essence of what we need to do is we need to shift and maybe not fully embrace, but shift towards a more what we call product like mentality. So one of the main differences between Silicon Valley products and defense products is defense products have always been built on services contracts. So that means the DoD thinks up what they want. They get a services contract to a services agency. They just perform the work. Whereas a product company takes on all of that requirement generation. They determine the products that they want to go build, but they use basically techniques and methods of embedding soldiers in with them and working with them every day to understand what will be their necessity, what will be their needs. And then together, in a very fast and rapid way, you iterate and you create your requirements. You create the things around what the system needs to do, how it needs to be integrated, what ranges it needs to be, and so on and so on. So this was not possible. This was not possible up to just a few years ago. It's a pretty recent experiment. It was done by the late Ash Carter, that secretary. He implemented something called the Adaptive Acquisition Framework. The purpose of that framework was to do exactly what we're talking about. It was to take defense contractors that were startups, that were product orientated, and allow them to have a mechanism to work with the Army and deliver products much faster. So the typical timeline on an MTA all the way to IOC and all the way to delivery is between 3 and 5 years. Now that's still a long time, and it may still be longer than we need, but my next generation jammer system, that program that I started back in 2013, is just now today being delivered to the fleet 11, 12 years later. So 3 to 5 years in DoD timeline and timescale is extremely fast. And we are currently in that sort of lane and working with the Army and working with Rapid Capabilities Critical Technologies Office of the Army to kind of accelerate and get through that MTA process.
Awesome. So speaking, ramping up, and you've talked about some of the applications of the force field. How do you think that it might change? When it comes to military planning, strategic thinking, how might these technologies impact?
That's a
planning?
great question, and I'll tell you the way that this is changing our way we fight war is starting with just short range air, and short range air is definitionally 10 kilometers radius, 6,000 feet AGL. That's the cylinder. In that cylinder, we're moving from the traditional fight, which war fighters say, we'll take one threat, one effector. One threat, one effector. We'll prosecute it through this OODA loop, and we'll end up prosecuting it. Well, now, that can't be the way we fight the fight anymore. We're looking at what we're doing, and we're looking at what we're seeing, and we're saying within that cylinder, at least, we have a one-to-many problem. We have one effector, one sensors, blah, 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 and we have thousands potentially of drones that are going to come and converge upon us. So this is a one-to-many problem. You say, uh-oh, well, that's hard. How do we solve it? Well, we're solving it. Waymo is solving it. When a Waymo car autonomously drives you down the road, it is solving one-to-many problems continuously as it's moving through and navigating through the world. So the short-range air cylinder needs to become a one-to-many space where we map the entirety. The data is just meshed throughout the entire 10 kilometers. You know where everything is at an instant. And you get these updates. Plus the command and control software, the software that's communicating to all the sensors and the effectors. It's thinking about one-to-many. It has commands like there is a volume of drones heading at us, and there's a centroid, and there's a density versus 1, 2, 3, 4 times 6,000. It just doesn't scale. None of it scales. And so not only do we have to implement and take high tech like these force fields out there that have the just natural kind of organic ability to be a one-to-many type of effector, what we also have to do is re-architect and rethink from the top down, at least in short range, how do we do command and control? How do we do sensing? How do we do everything? And it needs to look a little bit more like Waymo with some lasers on its head, like they say,
Sharks
sharks with lasers on their heads. These would be Waymo with lasers on its head,
Right.
basically, or in our case, high-powered microwave force fields on its head. That's what needs to be the next phase of warfare.
So, talk to us about these systems that you have. Some of your systems are called software-defined systems.
Yes,
right?
sir.
What does software-defined system mean? What does that mean? How does it work? How does it change sort of the nature of how things have been done historically? I know you talked about the pivot from services to product, right? Brandon Sang, who we had on earlier, was talking about this idea that we've got this requirements process in DoD. It shouldn't be a requirements process. It should be a problem-solution process. So, talk to us about how software-defined systems fit into that dynamic.
I'm going to use a metaphor. I'm going to go out of the field of DoD for a second, just for a second, and give you a metaphor. Okay. The old way that we created a directed energy system was much like a music box. Okay. A music box where you make all the mechanicals and all the little things. And when you play a song, you play one song. You play one song on the music box. And when you look into the music box, you can see how it's built and everything else like that. Now, the software on the music box is me cranking it, is the human playing the tune. All right. Park that. Software-defined system, a guitar. Still, the human is the software. But what can the human do? It can play any song. Any song. The music box has one song. The guitar has any song. And the software is still the human in both cases. So what we're building are software-defined systems. And what's so important about a software-defined system, especially when we're talking electronic warfare, is it's a cat and mouse game. And therefore, people that are flying these drones are going to have to go back and try to harden them. They're going to say, oh man, a force field just hit it. Maybe I could put shielding in. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I could do that. It's a very time-consuming, engineering-intensive type of job. They throw it over us. It might, that signal that we used last time, that electromagnetic pulse we used last time isn't working. Let's go through the software very quickly. Develop a new one, a new technique. Oh, that one works. So you see how you get this really unfair kind of advantage if your system is super capable, like a 12-string guitar or whatever that can play any song in the entire world, and you have basically software defining your changes or your upgrades or your scalability. It's not the system at all. The system just is really capable. You don't have to change anything about the hardware.
So does that mean the system has to be sort of operate at multiple frequencies, multiple power levels, multiple bandwidths, right? And if so, doesn't that make the core system a lot more expensive to build because it's got all these capabilities built in?
Well, the consumer electronics sort of spring, is just like a volcano. And when you go today, every day, I'm just surprised when I go to like microwave shows and things like where you can just buy simple off the shelf transceivers that go from like 0 to 6 gigahertz, like right from Motorola or from other companies like that. You can put a little wrapper around there, stick some antennas, and you have an electronic warfare jammer. I could build you an electronic warfare jammer in a couple weeks. If all the different systems are just tinker toys, it's like clicking things together. This is happening more and more and more on both the adversary side and on the friendly side. That's why Houthis can build missiles. That's why Houthis can build drones. They're tinker toying these things together and then sending them out. Well, we can do the same, and we see other startups doing the same to rapidly respond to try to take something in kind. Our system is a little more sophisticated, although we still heavily rely on consumer electronics. It's mostly built out of the consumer electronics sort of base and not a lot of custom boards or anything like that. Again, so we can rapidly iterate in the same way that our enemies are trying to do the same.
Okay, and as a little bit of a pivot, you're someone who's worked in both startups and larger major corporations. And Epirus itself labeled itself a neo prime. Love that term. I want to hear more about that.
Yeah.
What are some observations you've made between the difference in innovation happening in these smaller companies versus these larger, more established defense contractors, and how can these two groups work together?
That's great question. Just at the very kind of core of it all, when you look at Raytheon, when I worked there, although I've always been a little bit of a kind of a out of the box person, but when I worked at Raytheon, I felt very much like big Navy. I'm Navy officer, retired. One thing you didn't say, I'm retired lieutenant. Well, I think you did say it. So I was a nuclear engineer in the Navy, and I would go on these ships and they'd say, we're going to go to this port, and then we're going to go to this port, then we're going to go to this port, then we're going to go to this port. Now, like contrast that to a pirate ship. They don't know what ports they're going to. They don't know where the treasure is. They don't know where they're headed. They just hop on board and just set to sail. So that's a startup. So a startup is like a pirate ship. and a big companies like the Navy. And they're very different. Culturally, what we think about, what we prioritize, everything about how we behave is a lot different when you're a pirate versus big Navy. So, in a certain sense, the overlaps aren't great. They're not perfect, and in some cases, you might say, what are the things that the prime would be left to do if we could, like, let's say, scale Epirus to be nearly as big as a prime? Well, I think there are a lot of what we call tail business, like operations and sustainment, repair, field services, all of that. These large primes sometimes have 10,000 people globally that do field service support. Like, I don't need to build a 10,000 field service organization at Epirus. I'm an innovator. I want to stay on an earlier stage of the product development and even product production. So those are the places where I see kind of intersections. And then deeper inside the technology, a lot of times the primes have come to me and say, hey, can you make this transmit chain work better? Like, we're working closely with L3 Harris. Harris has got a whole bunch of radios that get real hot to touch. I said, we could fix that with all of this deep tech that we have down inside of our systems to make power transformation and conversion of power to RF very, 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 very efficient. We could do the same thing on your radios that are heating up the soldier's hands. So we're working with L3 Harris on some very advanced transmit chain technology, deep down. And you'll never hardly hear about it except just now, and maybe in a press release or something that L3 Harris and I do together. But it's something very important to what they're doing as well. So that's how a neoprime can operate. And we talked about neoprime. And neoprime's kind of like a strange thing. It's like a product company that finds itself in its way inside the DoD. So we don't act, we don't think, we don't care about things that the big defense primes think about. We act just much more like an Apple or a company more structured in that sort of a way.
So, look, we're here at RNDF. We know that the global competition's accelerating. China, Russia, pressing forward. They're thinking about defense modernization as well. So are Iran and North Korea, and even a lot of our smaller competitors. How do you see this question of defense modernization and the kind of technologies you're talking about playing for these other competitor and smaller nations? Because it strikes me that in a lot of ways, they're going to skip a generation. They're going to skip, sort of the F-35 generation of equipment, the M1A1 generation, and go straight to directed energy, right? Straight to the force field as you describe them, right? And if that's the case, are they going to be able to catch up or accelerate past us? And how do we avoid that from happening? How do we ensure that we maintain that strategic advantage when it comes to defense innovation?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I think there's just a small vector off of kind of the directionality that you were going. It's like when we think about defense things, this is what you're saying. You're thinking about like the old defense stuff, how you asked the question. You're like, how do we get a F-35 that goes and goes and goes and lasts forever? And then we just repair it, we sustain it, and then we modify it, maybe have it a little more features, put a new radar in it, put new missiles on it, so on and so on and so on. But this isn't the non-traditional asymmetrical war. Everything's going to be changing every year. This isn't going to be like, oh, we've got force field generators now, that's good enough. Well, software defined stuff maybe helps, that gets us going and everything else, but now we got to figure out a new jammer, or they figured out a new shielding and a way around our force fields. So that's going to be much more the pace of engineering, the pace of development. It's going to be buttressed up by all of the consumer electronics, the NVIDIA chips, all of that sort of stuff. And then very easily you can make industrial designs and different products from just leveraging kind of the core engineering that already exists out there.
Can the Department of Defense, architect the way it is, do that thing? That sounds like a really hard problem for our Department of Defense today as it stands to do. And a world, it seems like an impossible world for them to live in. Do we need something? Do we need new legislation? Do we need to rip it down and start over? It sounds like this is going to be very hard for them.
Well, there's always advantages and disadvantages to every culture and every administration. Okay. And like, for example, a President Xi administration might be very driven, might be very purposeful, might be very kind of all on the same page, but they're not going to tell President Xi about like, oh, I made a mistake or this thing isn't working right. So it could be a lot of BS, there could be a lot of failures. Like, that's what a really autocrat fascist type of regime is going to do to someone. Now, on the flip side, if you go completely like focused on the other stuff, you're like not ever getting anything done. And that's what we kind of find ourselves in America, where we're so fair, we're so nice, we're so this, we're so that nothing ever really gets done. You move along at just a snail's pace. So This administration coming in, I think, is going to be a hybrid. It's not going to be an autocratic fascist, God forbid, or anything like that, but it will be much more orientated like a businessman. And they're going to get things done. And a lot of the stuff that was troubling me or stopping me has to do actually not with the DOD. It has to do with the FAA, with the FCC, and other affiliated organizations. Because when the Ash Carter said, well, let's make this quick for some of these urgent material requests, he didn't go to the Department of Trade and the Department of Commerce and the Department of the FAA and say, we're doing this thing called this adaptive acquisition framework, and when these neoprimes are like ready to defend airports and stuff like that, you guys better be ready to receive it. Well, FAA didn't get that memo, and they're still not ready to receive it. And that's a trouble. That's a big trouble, and we're going to have to get on that in this administration and see if we can't straighten out the FAA.
Looks like we got our jobs cut out for us. Thanks so much, Andy, for joining us today. That's a wrap. Thanks to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI CTC team and helping us produce today's episode. You get to check this out on YouTube. You were recorded.
Right, great.
So please be sure to check out our episode there. And if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.